Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a fascinating but kind of overlooked corner of international relations. It's this thing called mutual intervention. You might not have heard the term before, but
Yeah.
you've probably seen it play out in the news. Think of it as like nations waging these proxy wars, supporting rebel groups in each other's territories instead of like
Yeah.
directly, fighting each other. It's surprisingly common, actually, especially over in Africa, where it's actually been more common than traditional, like, interstate warfare.
Yeah. What's really kind of fascinating about it is it challenges how we traditionally think about conflict and diplomacy. We're so used to thinking about wars as clear battles between nations, but mutual intervention kind of throws a curveball into that,
Go ahead.
because it introduces this whole web of relationships, different motivations and strategies that are often hidden beneath the surface.
Right. And that complexity raises some pretty intriguing questions, like why would nations choose this indirect approach, and how do these conflicts ever end? So today we're going to explore how the ups and downs of the fighting on the ground, the actual combat outcomes, can actually send powerful signals that shape negotiations and ultimately determine whether these tangled conflicts end in.
Like a stalemate or a handshake.
Exactly. Those combat outcomes are far more than just military victories or defeats. They're really information signals, revealing each side's true strength, their commitment level and test, their willingness to actually compromise.
Okay, so let's get specific. Our research actually uncovered this really striking statistic from a 2022 academic paper. It found that out of 23 mutual interventions in Africa between 1960 and 2010, only 10 ended with like a negotiated settlement. That means that the majority ended because one side basically gave up or collapsed internally. Not because both sides came to the table willingly. Why is that? Why are some resolved peacefully while others seem to drag on forever? Well, a key factor lies in those combat outcomes we were just talking about. You see, each nation's constantly watching the battlefield, both in their own territory and in their rivals. They're trying to gauge the strength of the rebel groups each side is supporting. And those results, they provide crucial information about each side's commitment to the conflict and their ability to actually achieve their goals.
So it's all about information and perception. Like if I'm seeing my supported rebels
Yeah.
getting crushed, it might make me rethink my whole strategy.
Exactly. It's like this high-stakes poker game where each nation's trying to read their opponent's hand, assess their own chances, and decide whether to fold, raise the stakes, or go all in. And just like in poker, there's a huge element of risk because each side is worried about making a move that could backfire and leave them in a worse position.
The dreaded commitment problem. It makes total sense in this context. If I agree to pull back my support for the rebels in your country, how can I be sure that you won't just keep supporting the rebels in mine? It's like a recipe for getting totally exploited.
Right, and that's where those combat outcomes, they come into play. They can provide a level of reassurance, or at least a clearer picture of what each side is truly capable of.
So to really understand how all of this works,
Yeah.
we need a concrete example, right? Can you walk us through a real-world case of mutual intervention where those battlefield signals played a decisive role?
Absolutely, the case of Chad and Sudan's mutual intervention. From 2005 to 2010, that's a perfect illustration of how those combat outcomes can shift the entire dynamic of a conflict.
Perfect. Let's dive into that. Give us the background. What was the situation on the ground, and how did those initial combat results shape each side's willingness to negotiate?
Well, from 2005 to 2006, both Chad and Sudan, they were on the defensive. They were both suffering defeats against the rebel groups backed by their opponent. Imagine the pressure they were under, their own territory under attack, their chosen proxies faltering, and the international community watching their every move.
That sounds like a recipe for desperation. Wouldn't that make them more open to cutting a deal just to stop the bleeding?
You'd think so, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Even though they were both losing, neither Chad nor Sudan was willing to negotiate at that point.
Why not? If they were both getting hammered, what was holding them back from at least trying to find a peaceful solution?
Well, each side was clinging to this hope that they could turn the tide. They were each waiting for a breakthrough, a decisive victory that would give them the upper hand and allow them to dictate the terms of any future agreement. It's a classic example of how even in a seemingly lose-lose scenario, the lure of potential victory can keep nations locked in a conflict.
I see. So even though things were bad, they weren't bad enough to outweigh that slim hope of coming out on top. But I'm guessing things didn't stay that way forever.
You're right. The situation shifted dramatically in 2007. Sudan managed to gain the upper hand against the Gilardian-backed rebels, within its borders. In fact, they were emboldened enough to launch a direct assault on Chad's capital in N'Djamena. Imagine the shockwaves that sent through the region.
Whoa, that's a major escalation. So now we're talking about a direct attack, not just supporting rebel groups anymore. That must have changed the whole calculus.
For both sides, absolutely. It was a total game changer. Sudan's success against those rebels wasn't just like a military victory. It sent a clear signal to Chad and like the rest of the world that they were serious, that they had the capacity and the will to escalate the conflict. It's like they were putting all their chips right in the middle of the table, daring Chad to call their bluff.
Exactly. And at that point, Sudan was in no mood to negotiate. They were like smelling victory, sensing weakness in their opponent. And they saw a potential path to like toppling the Chakadian regime altogether. Why settle for a piece of the pie when you think you can take the whole thing right?
Makes sense from their perspective. But what about Chad? How did they respond to this sudden shift in power?
Well, Chad was in a tough spot. They were facing a much more aggressive opponent. Their capital had been attacked, and their own chances of like outright victory seemed to be fading. But even then, they didn't immediately fold. So they were still holding out hope. What were they waiting for?
They were waiting for a sign, a shift in the balance of power that might make Sudan reconsider their position. And that sign came in 2009 when, surprisingly, both countries started to experience successes against the rebels they were battling.
Wait, so both sides were winning. That seems kind of counterintuitive. Wouldn't that just make them both more confident and less likely to negotiate?
That's where the nuance of these combat outcomes comes in. You see, while both countries were winning on their home turf, the rebel groups they were supporting were losing ground. This created a fascinating dynamic.
I'm starting to see it. So both Chad and Sudan were proving they could handle the internal threats they were facing. But their hopes of achieving a decisive win through their proxies were slipping away.
That's it. They were both strong enough to defend themselves, but not strong enough to dominate their opponent through those proxy forces. The realization dawned that this conflict was turning into a stalemate, a costly and exhausting war of attrition with no clear winner in sight.
So both sides were essentially stuck. They could keep fighting, but it wouldn't get them any closer to their ultimate goals.
Right, and that's the point where the calculus of conflict shifts, when the hope of a decisive victory fades and the costs of continued fighting mount. Even the most bitter rivals can start to see the appeal of a negotiated settlement.
So it wasn't just talks and diplomacy that finally brought Chad and Sudan to the table, but the actual combat results, the shifting tides of battle that revealed the true strength and limitations of both sides.
Precisely, those combat outcomes acted as incredibly powerful signals, providing crucial information that shifted perceptions and changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. And in 2010, this led to the signing of the Accord de N'Djamena, formally ending their mutual intervention.
This Chad-Sudan case is a perfect illustration of how messy and complex these conflicts can be. It's not just about military might, it's about information perception and the constant reassessment of goals and strategies based on what's happening on the ground. It's like a giant game of chess, but with real lives and national destinies hanging in the balance.
Absolutely, and it highlights a crucial point about international relations. Conflict resolution is rarely a linear process. There are setbacks, escalations, unexpected turns, and constantly shifting power dynamics. Understanding how those combat outcomes shape perceptions and influence decision-making is essential if we want to make sense of this complex world.
This has been super insightful, but now I want to shift gears a bit. Some of our listener comments, specifically those related to police body cams, brought up the legal concept of mutual combat. It seems relevant, almost like a smaller scale version of what we're talking about. Could you explain what mutual combat means in a legal context?
Absolutely. In the legal world, mutual combat refers to a fight that both parties willingly engage in. It's like saying, we both agreed to this, so we're both responsible for the consequences. But there's a fascinating legal wrinkle. If a fight that starts as mutual suddenly escalates, things change drastically.
How so? Can you give us an example?
Imagine two people agree to a fist fight, but in the heat of the moment, one person pulls out a knife. Suddenly, the entire nature of the engagement changes. The person facing the knife is now legally justified in using deadly force to defend themselves, even though they initially agreed to the fight.
So even if you consent to a fight, there are limits, lines that can't be crossed. That's pretty intense.
It is. The introduction of deadly force completely alters the equation, and this highlights a crucial point about both mutual combat and mutual intervention. The initial agreement or situation can evolve rapidly, and how each side perceives those changes can have huge consequences.
It strikes me that there's a powerful connection here, both mutual intervention on a global scale and mutual combat in a legal context, highlight the importance of information perception and how even seemingly clear-cut agreements can become murky and dangerous when those elements shift.
You've hit on a key insight, and to further illustrate this, let's look at some specific cases of mutual combat. In one example from California, a man was deemed justified in using deadly force when his opponent in a fight suddenly escalated the violence, even though they were both initially involved. That sudden shift in aggression changed the legal landscape.
So even in a situation where both sides initially agree to the terms of engagement, things can change drastically based on how events unfold and how each side interprets those changes.
Exactly. And in another case, a legal expert emphasized that fear of future harm doesn't automatically justify using force in the present. The threat needs to be imminent. This adds another layer of complexity to these situations, highlighting the crucial role of timing and perception in determining the legality of self-defense.
It's fascinating how these seemingly separate concepts, mutual intervention on a global stage and mutual combat, in a legal context, actually share these underlying themes of agreement escalation and the crucial role of information in shaping actions.
It really underscores the importance of understanding context and how perceptions shift as situations evolve.
Totally. It makes you think about how we analyze conflict, whether it's on a global stage or a personal level.
Exactly. And this brings us back to our main deep dive topic, mutual intervention.
Right. So we've established that combat outcomes are crucial in shaping negotiations and influencing whether these conflicts end peacefully.
Precisely, those outcomes aren't just isolated military events. They are powerful signals that reveal information about each side's capabilities and commitment.
And that information directly impacts their willingness to strike a deal and actually stick to it.
Think of it this way. Victories or even stalemates can boost a nation's confidence. It shows them that they can hold their own even against a rival supporting rebel groups within their borders.
So they're less likely to make concessions because they feel more secure in their position.
Exactly. On the flip side, a string of defeats can make a nation more desperate for a resolution.
They're facing a serious threat, and negotiation might start to look more appealing, even if it means swallowing their pride and making compromises.
But here's the catch. Even if a losing nation wants to negotiate, the winning side might not be interested.
Because they're smelling victory. They see a chance to push their advantage and potentially topple their rival's regime.
That's a common dynamic in these situations. It's why these conflicts can drag on for years, with both sides constantly reassessing the situation, looking for any edge.
So it's not just about who has the bigger army or the most advanced weapons, it's about information perception and the ever-shifting balance of power.
And that brings us to another crucial point. Mutual interventions rarely occur in a vacuum. There are often external factors at play, like pressure from international organizations or involvement from other nations.
But the global community isn't just sitting on the sidelines, They're often trying to mediate or impose sanctions or...
Yeah, even provide support to one side or the other.
Exactly. And these external factors, they can have a really significant impact on the course of the conflict.
Yeah.
For example, economic sanctions can really weaken a nation, making them more receptive to a negotiated settlement. It's like adding another player to that poker game. Someone who can change the stakes anders, really influence the player's decisions.
Perfect analogy. It highlights the complexity of these situations. There is a constant interplay between internal dynamics, external pressures, and
The strategic calculations of all the actors involved.
it's like a giant multi-dimensional chessboard, with each move having ripple effects across the whole board.
And that's why understanding these conflicts requires this deep dive. We need to look beyond the headlines, beyond those simplistic narratives, and really grapple with those intricate layers of cause and effect.
Absolutely. We need to understand the motivations, the constraints, and the often unintended consequences of actions. It's a reminder that the world of international relations is rarely black and white.
And it's full of surprises. 1 minute a nation might seem on the brink of collapse, and the next, they're pulling off this stunning victory. It's a world where information is power, and the ability to adapt and strategize is key to survival.
It's a constant game of shifting alliances, unexpected events, and
High-stakes decision-making.
it's a game with real-world consequences. The decisions made in these conflicts can determine the fate of nations and the lives of countless people.
That's why we do these deep dives. We want to equip our listeners with the knowledge and insights to understand these complex events, to see the world with a more informed and nuanced perspective.
Because knowledge is power, and the more we understand these dynamics, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges of an increasingly interconnected world.
Absolutely. So to recap, we've learned that mutual intervention is this fascinating, often overlooked aspect of international conflict, where nations engage in these proxy wars by supporting rebel groups within each other's territory.
And we've seen how combat outcomes in those internal conflicts can be crucial in shaping negotiations in us, influencing whether these interventions end peacefully or drag on for years.
Those outcomes act as powerful signals, revealing information about each side's strength and commitment, ultimately shaping their willingness to negotiate and team it, their ability to credibly commit to any agreements.
We even explored those intriguing parallels between mutual intervention on a global scale and the legal concept of mutual combat, highlighting how initial agreements can rapidly evolve and how information and perception are key drivers of decision-making.
So what does this all mean for you, our listeners? Why should you care about these seemingly distant conflicts and complex concepts?
Because these dynamics, these patterns of conflict and cooperation, they aren't confined to the realm of international relations. They play out on smaller scales, in organizations, communities, even in our personal lives.
We all encounter situations where we're trying to assess the intentions of others, weigh the risks and rewards of our actions, and navigate those tricky waters of conflict resolution.
Understanding how information shapes perceptions, how commitment issues can derail agreements, and how external factors can influence outcomes, that can be incredibly valuable in navigating those personal and professional challenges.
It's about recognizing those subtle signals, those shifts in power dynamics, and making strategic decisions based on the information available.
And perhaps most importantly, it's about recognizing that conflict isn't always a bad thing. It can be an opportunity for growth, for learning, for forging stronger relationships.
It's about approaching those conflicts with a mindset of understanding, seeking mutually beneficial outcomes, and being open to creative solutions.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a thought-provoking question. We've explored how nations can get entangled in these complex webs of mutual intervention, but could something similar happen on a smaller scale?
Could organizations, communities, even individuals find themselves locked in these cycles of indirect conflict, each supporting opposing forces in a struggle for power or influence?
It's something to ponder. As you go about your day, consider the parallels, the subtle ways in which information, perception, and commitment shape your own interactions and the conflicts you encounter.
And until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring, and keep seeking those aha moments that expand your understanding of the world around you.
Thanks for listening.